All right, well, let's move on. New rules this morning, online rules, to Labour's push to fix the NHS waiting time. So we're joined now by Shadow Paymaster General Jonathan Ashworth, MP. Good morning, Jonathan. So the Labour position, it's easy to shout from the sidelines, but your position, Jonathan, is that waiting times, of course, in the gutter. But what are you going to do to sort it out?
Well, of course, the analysis that we've released today indicate that on virtually all of their targets, in fact all of their targets, the vast majority of NHS trusts, that's the organisations who run the hospitals, have completely failed to miss their targets on waiting times for operations. And this is a consequence of 14 years of the Conservatives driving our NHS into the ground. So what's Labour's solution? We would introduce a proper tax on the very super wealthy non-doms, and we would use the proceeds from that to fund extra appointments, 2 million extra appointments a year in our NHS, so we can start driving those waiting times down. So that if you're waiting for a hip replacement or a knee replacement or hernia perhaps, a cataract operation you need, you can get your operations on time. Too many people are waiting in pain and agony at the moment for an operation after 14 years of the Conservatives.
Yeah, and I suppose if you want to point to track records, you can look to how Labour-run Wales is doing on the NHS. How are waiting times faring there?
I tell you a track record I can point to. The last Labour government brought waiting times down from 18 months to 18 weeks. That's the difference a Labour government at Westminster makes on the National Health Service. And for all your viewers who are struggling this morning to get a GP appointment when the GP phone lines open at 8 o'clock, struggling to see an NHS dentist, as you know you can't see an NHS dentist for love nor money, or waiting in pain for an operation, our message is a Labour government is going to start rebuilding our NHS, 2 million extra appointments a year in the NHS, more dentistry appointments, more mental health appointments, more appointments for knees and hip operations. That's the difference a Labour government will make.
It's not exactly a ringing endorsement for devolution then, if it'll only work under Labour if it's coming out of Westminster. It doesn't work in Wales where they're running their own show, because we all know the NHS is a disaster in Wales.
Well, there are different measurements in Wales, but of course, when you're running the National Health Service at Westminster, you're responsible for the overall budgeting, you're responsible for the overall staffing levels. One of the issues we've had in the NHS over these last 14 years is that we simply haven't had the staff because the training places for nurses were cut back very early on by George Osborne, for example. That's impacted on the NHS in Wales. So when we get a Labour government putting that extra investment in, driving up standards, demanding reform across the board in the NHS, making real use of technology and the advances that digital technologies would bring into the NHS, and indeed AI. You can do much more procedures and diagnostics by the use of AI. You can really transform the National Health Service for the 21st century. At the moment it's on its knees after 14 years of the Conservatives.
Yeah, Jonathan, some would argue the elephant in the room is the fact that the Tories have overseen, uncontrolled mass migration, a city the size of Birmingham every 2 years. Labour hasn't said what they're going to do about that. I mean, in fact, it will probably get worse, some would argue. So when you've got open borders like that and local services, the NHS, schools, GPs aren't being funded properly, how are you going to sort that out when you're not addressing the key issue, which is migration, putting pressure on all those services?
Well, it's absolutely chaos at the borders, isn't it? We were supposed to have order at the borders, and it's been the exact opposite, with the numbers of people crossing on boats, making those journeys across the channel because people smugglers are exploiting them. You've got to go after those criminal gangs in a proper way. Use terrorist-style laws to go after them. Stop being the soft touch on these criminal gangs that we've seen. But I tell you what, it's also going to ruin and be a problem for the NHS. The government announced yesterday that it is their policy, not an ambition, not a long-term aim, but their policy to abolish national insurance. That leaves them with a £46 billion black hole in their plans. It either means taxing pensioners more or it means cutting the NHS. And Jeremy Hunt, who told pensioners to wait longer for a hip operation or a knee operation because he said it wasn't a priority, Jeremy Hunt is now going to cut the NHS or he's going to tax pensioners more. That's the big threat at this next general election.
I think what's been really interesting about Wes Streeting in his plans to reform is his openness about using the private sector to help ease a lot of the pressure on the NHS. I just can't get my head around why, on the one hand, it's OK to take advantage and use the private sector when it comes to health, but when it comes to education, where people are paying their taxes still, but then using private schools, you want to penalise those people. In actual fact, instead of using the private sector to ease the state, you want to make that situation worse.
Well, that's a question about the taxation regime. And as you know, because the Conservatives ran the economy off a cliff, because they played fast and loose with the public finances,
you want to
they've
penalise
made a
children.
mess of the public finances, and people are paying more on their mortgage. You've got to take some tough taxation decisions. And if we tax those private schools, the proceeds of that money is going to go into an expansion of mental health support in schools, and it's going to help us fund some of our other plans to recruit more teachers in schools, for the schools that the vast majority of GB News viewers' children go to.
Yes, go on.
Jonathan, just talking about Wes Streeting, what's your thoughts on his language over the weekend off the back of the election results, calling voters of Susan Hall, the London mayoral candidate, white supremacists and Islamophobes? Is that the kind of language we expect from a government in waiting?
Well, people, in the heat of an election campaign say things, but I am pleased that we won, Sadiq Khan won in London and beat Susan Hall. Convincingly, actually. It was a very convincing victory, wasn't it, when perhaps people were suggesting that the Conservatives were going to win that. And if you look at some of the other races that happened last week, North Yorkshire, which is Rishi Sunak's backyard.
Jonathan, I'm asking you about Wes Streeting's language, not the election results.
Yeah, I've said, it is linked to the election, and I just said it's people say things in the heat of the moment. But on those elections, I think it shows that, yes, Labour was winning the argument, but the next general election is a real contest. The next general election is a real competition between whether you want a Labour government and changing this country, or whether you want to continue with Conservative failure. But it is going to be a real contest, that next general election. But we're going to continue to make the arguments. We're going to continue to do all we can to win the trust of the British people, including GB News viewers. And then we're going to talk more about how we're going to fix the NHS, how if you're a young person struggling to get on the housing ladder, how we're going to build more homes for young people so they can realise that dream of home ownership, how children going to our primary schools will have access to a breakfast club in every primary school, and how we're going to cut energy bills for good.
Jonathan, one final quick question, very briefly, apologies. There seems to be a consensus on social media from Labour MPs in recent days about the situation in Rafah in Gaza. That's a stark contrast to some of the behaviour we've seen in recent months. Are you bowing down to these 18 demands from the Muslim vote?
No, let me be absolutely clear. We have said quite rightly for some time now that a military offensive into Rafah would be catastrophic. I think half the children in Gaza are in this part of the Gaza Strip. We've already seen thousands of people lose their lives, killed, many women and children. I've been calling for some time now for an immediate ceasefire. I am warning against this intervention, this offensive into Rafah. We also need the access for humanitarian aid. We also need the hostages released, but there is a catastrophe facing us, and the international community need to work to bring about that immediate ceasefire and bring an end to this horrendous conflict.
So do you think Labour would bow down to any of those 18 demands, one being to cut all military ties with Israel, another changing the definition of extremism that Michael Gove brought in? Do you foresee any of those demands being adhered to by Sir Keir Starmer?
Well, I don't know what the particular demands you are, but I'll go off and look into them. But we do not bow down to whatever campaign groups. We are acting in what we think is the correct way, and we have been calling for an immediate ceasefire for some time. We've been warning against an offensive into Rafah. We've been calling for hostages to be freed, and we've been calling for proper humanitarian assistance to free into that part of the world. This is a catastrophe. Thousands of people have lost their lives, including women and children. We've got to work internationally to bring about peace and a ceasefire.
OK. Shadow Paymaster General Jonathan Ashworth, always a pleasure. Thanks very much indeed for joining us here on GB News.